He bought a restricted handgun from a licensed dealer, drove it straight home, locked it up exactly the way the law requires, and felt completely confident he had done everything right. 6 months later, on a completely different drive, he got pulled over with that same handgun in his vehicle, properly unloaded, properly locked, properly contained, and he still walked away with a charge. Not because of how the firearm was stored, because of where he was driving it. And that single distinction is something most legal, responsible Canadian gun owners genuinely do not understand about the authorization to transport system, even years after using it. Here's what the ATT actually is, in plain terms. If you own a restricted or prohibited firearm in Canada, and for most people that means a handgun, you cannot simply put it in your car and drive it anywhere you want, even if it is perfectly stored, even if your license is completely valid. You need specific authorization for that specific trip. That authorization is called an authorization to transport, and it is separate from your license itself. Your PAL says you are allowed to own a firearm. Your ATT says you are allowed to move it from one specific place to another specific place. Those are two different permissions, and conflating them is exactly where this goes wrong for people. Let's go through what most gun owners actually know, and then get to the part most of them miss entirely. Fact 1. Since the federal government changed the rules in 2021, your license comes with an automatic ATT built in for certain specific situations. You do not need to apply separately for these. The most common one is travel to and from an approved shooting range in your province. If you are a licensed restricted firearms owner heading to a club or range that has been approved under the Canadian Firearms program, that trip is automatically authorized under your license. No separate paperwork required. Fact 2. That same automatic authorization covers bringing a newly purchased restricted firearm home from a licensed business. If you walk into a gun store, complete the purchase, and the transfer is approved, you are automatically authorized to transport that firearm directly home. Again, no separate application needed for that specific trip. Fact 3. Outside of those automatically covered situations, you need a separate specific ATT issued by your provincial or territorial chief firearms officer. This covers things like taking your firearm to a gunsmith for repair, bringing it to a police station or CFO office for verification, moving it because you are relocating to a new residence, or transporting it for other specific approved purposes. Each of these requires you to apply and receive a distinct authorization before that particular trip happens. Some provinces issue conditions that cover certain repeat trips for a defined period, but the key point is that the purpose of the trip has to match what was actually authorized. Now here is fact 4, and this is the one that catches the most people completely off guard, including gun owners who have been doing everything correctly for years. Your ATT is not just about the destination, it is about the route. Authorizations to transport are generally issued and automatically granted on the basis of direct travel between two specific points: your home and the range, your home and the dealer, your home and the gunsmith. They are not a general license to drive around with a restricted firearm in your car for the rest of the day. If you leave the range and stop somewhere unrelated on the way home, running an errand, picking up groceries, swinging by a friend's place, you have technically stepped outside the scope of what that authorization was meant to cover. The firearm being perfectly stored inside a locked container does not change that. The problem is not how the gun is being carried. The problem is that the trip itself no longer matches the authorized purpose. This is exactly the kind of detail that never comes up in casual conversation among gun owners, because on a normal day, nothing happens. Nobody gets pulled over, and the gap between what is technically authorized and what actually occurred never becomes visible. It only becomes a problem the one time it intersects with a traffic stop, a checkpoint, or any other interaction where an officer ends up asking what that firearm is doing in your vehicle and where it is actually going. And here's why this matters so much more than people assume. Unlike a simple consent issue, where the protection is mostly about what you say and whether you agree to a search, an ATT problem exists independently of anything you say at all. If your transport does not match the scope of what was authorized, that gap exists in the paperwork and the purpose of the trip itself, not in your behavior during the stop. Saying the right thing at a traffic stop does not retroactively fix a transport authorization that did not cover the actual trip you were on. This is also where people get tripped up by something that sounds harmless on the surface: moving to a new address. If you relocate, the location tied to your storage and your automatic ATT coverage changes with you, and many gun owners do not realize they need to update this, or in some cases, obtain new authorization that reflects their new circumstances before transporting firearms to or from the new residence in situations that fall outside the standard automatic categories. People assume that paperwork simply follows them. It does not always work that way, and assuming it does is how an otherwise careful gun owner ends up out of compliance without ever intending to break a single rule. So what should you actually do with all of this? Before you transport a restricted or prohibited firearm anywhere, ask yourself a specific question. Does this trip fall under one of the automatic categories built into my license, or does it require a separate ATT that I need to have already obtained? If you are going to an approved range or bringing home a new purchase from a licensed dealer, you are generally covered automatically. If you are doing anything else, going to a gunsmith, attending an event, transporting after a move, anything outside those two specific situations, confirm with your provincial chief firearms officer office that you have the correct authorization before you put that firearm in the vehicle, not after. Keep your route as direct as reasonably possible between the authorized points. Avoid turning a covered trip into an uncovered one by adding stops that have nothing to do with the purpose that was actually authorized. If your circumstances change, a new address, a new vehicle, a new storage location, check whether that change affects your existing authorization rather than assuming everything carries over automatically. And understand the core distinction running underneath all of this. Storage answers the question of how your firearm is being kept inside the vehicle. The ATT answers a completely different question, whether you were legally permitted to be transporting it on that specific trip in the first place. A firearm can be flawlessly stored and still be in violation because storage and authorization are not the same requirement, and meeting one does not automatically mean you have met the other. Most gun owners learn this system once during their licensing process and then never revisit it again for years. The rules have not stayed perfectly static since then, and the specific situations that are automatically covered versus the ones that require separate authorization are exactly the kind of detail that fades from memory long before it actually matters. The day it matters is never a quiet day at home. It is always the day something else is already happening, a stop, a checkpoint, an unrelated complication. And that is the worst possible moment to discover that the trip you are on was never actually the trip your paperwork covered. Know your categories, know your routes, know exactly what your authorization was actually issued for, not just what you assume it covers. That is the entire difference between a perfectly legal drive home and a charge that started with a piece of paper nobody thought to double check.